Next year is the 20th anniversary of democracy. In 1994, in terms of the policy for higher education, there were two key imperatives. One was the imperative for equity in the context of addressing access given the historical inequalities in the higher education system. And secondly, the imperative of development. By development, I mean, what are the kinds of knowledge, skills, competencies that we require in order to address both social and economic development in the country. So there's been tremendous change from an equity point of view. But it's equity in absolute numbers. We have currently just under 1 million students in higher education. So that gives you an indication, if we're looking at it from the breakdown, 80-20%. Similarly, we have more women, young women in higher education than we have men. In fact, I think about 55 to 56% of students in higher education are female. So the males are a dying breed in higher education. Only 14% of the African age cohort is in higher education. I think it's 12% for colored students. It's 46% for Indians, and over 57, I think it's 57% for whites. So when you start looking at equity in terms of the age cohort in higher education, there are continued significant inequities in the system. So while in absolute terms the system has changed, in proportionate terms, in relative terms, there's still many more white and Indian students of the age group getting into higher education than there are African or colored students. So from an access point of view, we still have a major issue to address. On average, only 50% of students leave higher education with a qualification after 5 years. So we have quite a big problem about the gap between school and university. There are obviously financial issues for large numbers of students who come from poor backgrounds. There's not sufficient, while government has put in large amounts of money through the student loan and bursary scheme, it's never sufficient to meet the demands and needs of all the students who are in higher education. So many students may be dropping out. We don't have the figures because they're unable to afford what higher education is not cheap. So we have a challenge, if you want, of access in terms of addressing, and that's a long-term thing. We can't overnight change the kinds of proportions we have, and that's why there's a commitment to increase the number of institutions we have. But the bigger question we then have to ask, it's easy to build a new institution. Do we have the capacity to ensure that the young people who enter those institutions are going to be able to graduate appropriately with a qualification? And we are not attracting enough young people across the board, irrespective of race and gender, into higher education who want to pursue academic careers and will then in turn pursue careers in the universities and higher education institutions. So we do face some major challenges in being able to ensure that we have the staff who are going to be able to in future to teach our children who enter higher education, that we have the personnel who are going to be able to research that we need to do in order to grow the country and so forth. But let me stop there.
So the racial kind of and the gender kind of issues are still a challenge within higher education institutions. The other challenge that we're having, I will come to the opportunities, is the issue of expansion. I think this has been raised for quite a number of times, that our higher education institutions are not expanding. And that is the case with both private and public kind of higher institutions. We have seen in the last years where there has been a lot of stampede, where learners were seeking admissions and they could not find. So we do not have expansion, which is a problem of planning at the end of the day. Because if we realize that the number of students that will come from the schooling system, there will be projected to be an X number that's getting to higher education institutions, proper planning is supposed to be done. And when I'm talking about expansion, I'm talking expansion in terms of the infrastructure, expansion in terms of personnel, and expansion in terms of other facilities that are required by students, like your accommodation and other issues. We are seeing serious challenges. Access also related to the issues of expansion. It's still a difficult mission to get into higher education institutions because of the point system, especially in the gateway subjects. It's still an issue of access in terms of funding and also in terms of the curriculum offerings that are done in different institutions at the end of the day. So once we have this kind of differentiation, that is a problem because most of the institutions are offering more or less the same kind of qualifications. But there is no articulation. You can't do first year, second year, and move to another because of various reasons. So the issues of articulation are also a challenge. When we were brought up, we knew that if you go to university, you'll really get a better job. These days, it's not the case. It depends. What type of a subject are you doing? And also it depends on the type of the institution. We are funding quite a number of students that we're providing bursaries to. But it is very difficult to get them passing within a record time. And most of them drop out within the program, especially the first year students. Opportunities. I must say that if you compare South Africa with other countries and the southern Sub-Saharan kind of countries, you'll find that we have a fairly large higher education sector in the country. I mean, if you talk about 23 public institutions, it's quite a lot, which should be giving a competitive advantage to the country at the end of the day, for it to have a highly skilled and capable workforce and have people that are able to have the intellectual capacity that is required by the country. The government, and especially Higher Education Ministry now, has dedicated a big chunk of funding towards those that would aspire to be getting their degrees, and that funding through the NSFAS. It is more available than it used to be. But what is also worrying in terms of that kind of competition and quality assurance systems that are in place, when these numbers of learners fail, they don't progress, they remain unemployed. Unlike schools, no one takes accountability within the higher education system.
The fact is, when the South African qualifications, the National Qualifications Framework was set up, it carried that baggage of trying to rectify most of the wrongs of the past in terms of redress and access, and generally speaking, trying to level, if you like, the playing field, if you like, of the education and training setup. Now, I don't mind nailing my colors to the mast. I am an advocate of the National Qualifications Framework. Otherwise, I wouldn't be working where I am working. I believe it to be a very useful mechanism for enabling some very useful conversations to take place amongst key players in the education and training landscape. And I'm not just talking here in terms of just the universities, I'm talking about other sites where learning actually takes place. And in most instances, one is talking about the occupational types of places. In the context of the National Qualifications Framework, several things become more easily facilitated. There's a worldwide recognition of the idea of lifelong learning, for example. And I think that qualifications frameworks do actually facilitate that process whereby people of all ages can engage with the education and training landscape. And I think that provided we continue to drive some of the original objectives and aspirations that were expressed in the original legislation, we can begin to influence the way that education and training happens in higher education institutions. Quality will remain an issue, but then there are statutory bodies that are set up to monitor issues of quality. The system quite deliberately was set up to not recognize people's competencies or attainments. And I do feel that part of what the program we can drive in higher education articulation has been mentioned as an issue. But for me, also the recognition of prior learning is a very important part, which I don't feel to date we have adequately dealt with, but I'm still very optimistic about it. Academics complain that the kind of quality of material that seeks to join their institutions, they're not up to it, and they throw their hands up in defeat almost. But I think there's an opportunity there for universities to play a part. We can't sit, fold our arms and say, look, the entrance into higher education are just not good enough. What can we do? I think there are things that higher education can do to address those deficits, whether it's a greater focus on bridging courses or, as I said, recognition of prior learning and so on. I think those are great opportunities for us. Clearly, our stable political system, our relatively successful economy in terms of the African continent, is proving something of a magnet. And what this is doing is actually helping us to focus and recognize that we are located in Africa. We're not some outpost of the UK or America or whatever. And I think that diversity of skills coming from the rest of Africa and the rest of the world can only be a good thing. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you very much.